For the very first time in 60 years, Cuba will not be led by a Castro. Last month, Raul Castro, the brother of a famous revolutionary Cuban leader and former Prime Minister Fidel Castro, announced his resignation from the office of his head of Communist Party. As desired by him, the baton has been passed on to a younger generation and Miguel Díaz-Canel take over the chief of the party. But does it really mean the end of an era? What are the shades of the legacy of the Castros for a country which struggles to manage a shaky economy and a ravaging pandemic? Or is the younger generation ready to look beyond the legacy itself? How would the new development change the course of US-Cuban relations? Would sanctions be removed and would Russia keep an eye on the development of the shores of an island nation? To unravel the shades of the situation, from Toronto, Canada, joins us Keith Bolendor, an expert commentator on the Cuban affairs. Keith is a member of the Institute for Public Accuracy and has expressed himself on the issue across platforms like Guardian, United Nations, and Scottish National Parliament. Keith has also written 3 books on Cuba-US relations, namely Voices from the Other Side, an oral history of terrorism against Cuba, Cuba Under Siege, American Policy, the Revolution and its People, and Manufacturing, the Enemy, the Media War Against Cuba. Keith, we welcome you to our platform, The Voices.
Thank you very much for having me.
Keith, to begin with, the development in Havana has suddenly triggered the buzz about the legacy of the Castros. What actually this legacy is in political, economic, social, and cultural terms?
I mean, the Cuban Revolution that established, for the first time, true Cuban independence was the result of Fidel Castro's movement with his supporters, including his brother Raul, Che Guevara, and the others. So that's ingrained in Cuban society, culture, and that's not going to change whether there's a Castro in power or whether there is not a Castro in power. Fidel Castro stepped down 10 years ago. He's been dead for 3, almost 4 years. Raul Castro stepped down just this past month at the latest Communist Party Congress. But the revolution continues within the framework of what Fidel and Raul and the revolution means. Now you have a new generation led by Díaz-Canel, the new president, who is also the first secretary of the Communist Party. So there is a shift in specifics of what Fidel and the first generation revolutionaries brought to Cuba, but it's a continuation. It's like any society that evolves when you have new generation, new ideas. Cuba is being influenced and affected by new technologies like any other country in the world. The foundation of the revolution maintains. Those who want to improve it will want to improve it within the context of the revolutionary society, the social justice programs, the efforts to egalitarianism, all the things, the positive things that the revolution has brought to Cuba for the past 60 years. But it won't be exactly the same. It can't be. Fidel and Raul have often said the revolution has to evolve for it to maintain itself and for it to be successful. And that's exactly what's happening now under the new leadership. There was changes to some of the top party positions, newer people coming in. So the revolution is evolving as it should be.
Okay. There is a generation, as you said, now, which remembers the poverty and inequality they faced before the Castros, and hence they are committed to the legacy despite minor disagreements. But do you figure out a generational gap when it comes about the affiliation of the youngster to this thought? I mean, do you find the younger generation equally committed to this? And does the recent protest in the island nation suggest that young Cubans may look beyond the conventional thought of the revolution, especially when they are enabled by a wider information access thanks to the 2018 launch of 3G services in the nation?
Yeah, absolutely. The first generation revolutionaries saw the difference between pre-revolutionary society and what the revolutionary movement brought. The younger generation didn't experience that, so they've accepted the revolutionaries' positives, the free healthcare, free education, housing, the ability and the majority to feed the people. So they don't react to the same way, and it is a generational conflict. The older generation doesn't understand why the younger generation doesn't have the same passion and the same ability to connect. It's impossible. It's impossible because the younger generation didn't live through what the first generation revolutionaries did. And it's a real conflict. It's a real challenge for the Cuban government to maintain the support of the younger generation. There's the majority of the Cubans who are leaving the country for economic reasons are the younger generation. Cuban society is getting older in general, and it's a real challenge and a real problem for the Cuban government to overcome. They're doing it in a number of different ways. Cuban society has always been very participatory, and the attempt for the Cuban government to connect with the younger generation is absolutely vital. They're doing it successfully in some ways. You are seeing protests in San Isidro, and that's okay. I mean, for the younger generation to express itself within the confines of wanting to improve the revolution under, as I said before, under the foundational structure of what the revolution represents. So it's a hugely complicated situation for the Cuban government to connect with the younger generation. There's no way they're going to be able to connect with it like the first generation revolutionaries did, but there's still a tremendous amount of support within the young generation to improve society within the confines. Now, everything we've talked about, everything we've commented so far has left out one of the most major elements of complicating the connection with the Cuban government and the younger generation, and that's the effect of the American embargo and the continuing regime change programs that the United States imposes on the government.
Yeah. Keith, this is a nation which witnessed an economic decline of almost 11% in 2020, and it imports about 2/3 of its food essentials. To what extent they can afford to continue with their traditional model of governance when this resignations present the leadership with an opportunity to shift the gears in policy, and how fit this Miguel Díaz-Canel is to lead the revised edition?
Well, there are since Díaz-Canel took over as president, and even before that, as Raul Castro was president, the Cuban government recognizes economic reforms are necessary. And they've gone to a great length to introduce a number of economic reforms, such as private ownership of homes, cars, expanding private businesses, cooperatives. There's a lot further things they can do, but they are recognizing the traditional economic model of the first generation revolutionaries isn't working in today's society. They understand that, and it connects with what we talked about before. It's connecting with the younger generation who don't necessarily want to live under the economic restrictions or economic regulations of the first generation revolutionaries. So the government is balancing economic reforms that are necessary, but not going too far to undermine the core principles of the revolution. They just recently finally reunified the currency, which is a huge step in moving forward in the Cuban economy, eliminating the tourist peso and strengthening the national peso in connection with the American dollar. So the Cuban government has for years recognized the need for economic reforms, and my opinion is they're going to be accelerating it once they get through the COVID crisis, once the economy, which is so much based on tourism, gets back to some sort of normalcy. When that is, it's hard to say. Hopefully, as soon as possible.
Keith, what you're suggesting is that yes, the grip of the Viva Fidel emotion maintains over the Cuban society, but the change was already taking place even when the Castros were on the helm of the government, right? Okay. Keith,
Absolutely. When Fidel stepped down and Raul took over, one of his first statements was, we can't continue to do what we've been doing. We need to reform the economy. He was the one who really pushed the expansion of tourism into Cuba. And it's had such a tremendously positive effect on the economy and also on the interactions with Cuba and the rest of the world. So Raul Castro really set the table for these economic reforms that the current president Díaz-Canel is continuing and will expand over the next few years, without doubt.
Okay. Moving ahead, talking about the international implications of the development, before entering into the expected change in dynamics under Biden administration, just expose us to the way Castro years impacted US-Cuba relations and how big was the diversion during Obama administration, which restored full diplomatic ties between the country, of course, for a short while.
Yeah, that's a key question. I mean, one of the rationales for the embargo, the blockade, as the Cubans call it, economic punishment against the Cuban people, that the Americans always said was that as long as Fidel Castro was in power, the embargo was going to stay in place. Well, then he stepped down, and then the Americans said, well, as long as Raul Castro is in power, the embargo is going to stay in place, because American policy is based on they would not allow the Castros to continue running the country before they would end the embargo. Well, neither Castro's in position of power in the government, and the embargo is still in place. So it's just one of the many contradictions of American policy. Whatever reason, whatever rationale the Americans have to continue the economic punishment against the Cuban citizens, really doesn't matter. They said when Cuba was connected with the Soviet Union, that was the reason why the embargo was still in place. Well, they're no longer connected. The Soviet Union is not even around anymore, but the embargo continues. So then you look at the real reason why the Americans have been positioning themselves as supporting regime change ever since the revolution of Cuba, and it goes back historically to American possession of Cuba, the objection of Cuban independence, and the desire to establish another neo-colonial situation into Cuba. For years, decades, American strategy of regime punishment, the economic embargo, the anti-Cuban propaganda, the pressure for other countries not to trade with Cuba, the hundreds of terrorist acts against Cuban citizens that were conducted with the support of the American government by Cuban American anti-revolutionary groups in Florida. So all these elements combine to incorporate the regime change strategy of the United States against Cuba. That changed under Obama in 2014. But move towards normalizing relations with Cuba. The strategy changed, but the objective didn't. Obama's shift from punishment to normalization still maintained the same objective: regime change. Obama thought the influx of American businessmen, American tourism, being friends with Cuba and moving towards a normal relationship would be the impetus to change, to end the revolution. It didn't work that way. What happened was the Americans were coming down. I was in Havana many times with American tourists. American business were coming down. The cruise lines were coming in. And it was the American side that was learning more about the Cubans than the Cubans were learning about the Americans. So the policy of regime change just wasn't working, because the Americans still can't get it through their head after 60 years. There is still majority support within the Cubans for the revolution, despite the differences, despite the wanting to change, but there's still a support. So then when Donald Trump became president, he ended that. And the 4 years of Trump's administration were really bad for Cuba. He reinstituted all the punishments. He ended a lot of the tourism, if not most of the tourism. He instituted the end of remittances from the United States into Cuba. So he really made things much worse. And that was based on the support of the far right Cuban American congressmen who supported the return to the punishment. So then the last thing Trump did was relist Cuba on the states that sponsor terrorism. And that was really galling for the Cuban side, because of the amount of terrorism the Cuban citizens have suffered from the American side. So Trump really did tremendous damage with the Cuban-American relations. So now Biden is in power, and the expectation is that he has said publicly that he will, go back towards more of the Obama policy of normalization, but so far nothing, absolutely nothing has happened. There's talk, there's still an expectation that Biden will start introducing some measures, including allowing remittances to come back into Cuba, easing up on travel, but absolutely nothing has happened to this date.
What do you expect the trajectory from here? Means how US would be taking out?
Yeah, I honestly didn't think Biden would even look at Cuba till after his first year. He's got a few things on his plate, the COVID, trying to push through some absolutely incredibly major bills within Congress. So I think Cuba is still on his radar, but he's prioritizing as every president should. Now the pro-Cuban side says, well, it doesn't take Biden long just to sign an executive order saying, okay, we're going to allow remittances back. We're going to start the process to end Cuba's listing on the states that sponsor terrorism. And they're right. It's not a huge effort on Biden's part to start eliminating some of Trump's restrictions, but he hasn't done it yet. And there is a bit of a shift because his Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has said, yes, we will look at the Cuba issue, and we do support more interchanges with Cuba and the pulling back of the Trump restrictions, but he said, we expect Cuba to make concessions. And this has always been the dynamic. The American perception is we're going to end the embargo, but we won't end it unless Cuba gives up all these things. And the Cuban position is, well, we can't negotiate our sovereignty, and you can't tell us how to operate within our own country. This embargo and these regime change programs should be ended on its own sake for normal relations. So there is this dynamic that the Biden administration has tied in concessions on Cuba's part much more than Obama did in regards to normalization process. So we'll see how that plays out. It should, by the end of the year, we should have a much better idea of where the Biden administration is going in regards to their policy with Cuba.
Okay. And do you think Russia would keep an eye on the situation and extend humanitarian services to develop equations with an ally, support for which has been a cherished chapter of history?
Yeah, yes, I think, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Cubans and the Russians were pretty well estranged, and they didn't have much interaction with each other. The last few years, the Russians have become more involved in Cuba economically, policy-wise. They've sent advisors there. They've expressed an interest to reconnect with Cuba. I think it's a natural, regardless of what the Biden administration does, what the United States does in their relationship with Cuba. Cuba, since the fall of the Soviet Union, has always been very interested in expanding their international connections, not only reestablishing with Russia, but they have very good relations with China. They've had excellent relations with Latin America, depending on the political climate within Latin America. Left wing had a number of countries a few years ago. The relations were really good. It's shifted a bit, and now it's moving back and forth. But their relations with Latin America are still very positive. Europe, they've always expressed interest in connecting with Europe, and again, those relations have been up and down. So their position internationally is still much better than it was during the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. But with Russia, yeah, I really believe there's going to be an increase. What Cuba's looking for now, and it's one of the largest situations to overcome, is foreign investment. And that's one of the driving forces of why economic reforms are taking place in Cuba, because they've had very little success attracting the level of foreign investment they were looking to get. So they're looking for investment on a huge number of projects. They've opened up the possibility of foreign entities coming into Cuba and investing, including holding a majority of the ownership projects in Cuba. They've said Cuban Americans are open to more possibilities of investing in Cuba. That's really one of the keys of the Cuban economy over the next few years, how successful they're going to be to attract foreign investment.
You have been a journalist by profession, and you know a lot in international politics is about how media postures the developments. So what's your take on the media coverage of the recent developments? Are they being too skeptical? And for years the American side of the story was something which they endorsed a lot. So what's your take on the recent coverage by media?
Well, that was my whole last book, is how the media has covered Cuba, and from a corporate media, mostly from America, but also from the Western liberal countries, how they've covered Cuba. It's been pretty consistent. In fact, I'd say it's been overwhelmingly consistent. Even before the revolution, the American media was quite anti-Cuban, quite biased with their misinformation about Cuba. Since the revolution, the media has been consistently misinformed about how the revolution society works, the foundational reasons for the revolution, and why Cuban society, why the Cuban people still support the revolution. So in general, the corporate media has really been so influential in forming this negative narrative against Cuba. And of course, the corporate media is so influential in shaping the general public's opinion, specifically in foreign affairs, because most Americans can't go to Cuba to see for themselves the good, the bad, and the indifferent. So they rely on the media, and especially corporate media, to tell them what countries are good and what countries are bad. And you see that consistently, not just Cuba. You can pick America's adversaries, and how the media has shaped the reasons why people perceive negatively about Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, countries that the Americans have designated as adversaries, and how the general public perceives American allies like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and other countries. So the media has had tremendous influence in shaping attitudes about Cuba, and most of them have been based on myths and misinformation and biases. So to answer your question directly, when Obama opened things up in Cuba in 2014, it was interesting. The American media sort of split. The right-wing media said, yeah, we'll support the opening, but Cuba has to give all these concessions. Basically, they have to give up the revolution before Obama should normalize relations. Where the supposed left-wing media, like the New York Times, said, yeah, we do support it, but be careful because the Cubans might just take advantage of the Americans. And it was still based on the concept that America had the right to promote regime change programs, regardless of whether it was using the punishment or whether it was using the positive things. So when Trump ended Obama's openings and went back to the restrictions, the media was fairly critical against Trump's return to the restrictions, because they were convinced Obama's opening was going to be the final end of the Cuban Revolution, that Obama's strategy was the one that was going to end the revolution. So they were saying, well, Trump shouldn't go back to the restrictions because Obama's policies were actually working towards the end of the revolution. Both positions were wrong. The revolution wasn't going to end with the restrictions or wasn't going to end with the normalization. Currently, under Biden, there hasn't been a huge amount of media attention. What there has been fairly consistent, that Biden should move towards more of a normalization path. The media was pretty well against Trump relisting Cuba on the states that sponsor terrorism. But again, the media's perspective, which is a consistent reflection of American foreign policy, is regime change. So the media can take different attitudes, different levels of it, but the underlying media coverage is American policy is designed to expedite and finalize regime change against the revolution, because corporate media reflects the established ruling class within the United States, even Canadian media reflects it, European media. So corporate media has always been consistent in the position that regime change and that the Cuban Revolution should end. There's exceptions within that, which I explore in the book, but the overwhelming perspective of the corporate media is supportive of regime change. Now, secondary media, alternative media, that's a whole different thing. That obviously doesn't have the same impact in shaping foreign policy or in shaping public perceptions as the corporate media does.
Okay, thanks a lot, Keith. You exposed us to so many shades of the situation and the developments, and we are really thankful that you took out the time for our platform, The Voices. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Anytime.